Good morning and welcome to today's webinar as part of the RTPI's wider online programme bringing together case studies from the UK and internationally, fostering the exchange of ideas globally. In this hour-long session, you will hear perspectives on new towns and new settlements from around the world, including Indonesia and Milton Keynes. I'm Megan Wilson, Planning Director at Marans and RTPI East Midlands Young Planners Chair and today's event chair. I am joined today by Hendrikus Andi Simanatra, President of the Indonesian Association of Urban and Regional Planners on Indonesia's new capital city, David Mountain, RTPI Research Manager, Robert Temple, author of a new book on Indonesia's new capital city, and Fiona Robinson, Milton Keynes Council's Strategic Lead for City Projects. If you have any questions, please add these under the Q&A tab, and these will be answered at the end of the webinar by the panel of speakers that we are listening to today. You will find a handout under the Handout tab. Please note that when the webinar closes, you will be prompted to complete a quick survey. We very much appreciate this. And without further ado, I will now hand over to Hendrikus Andi Simanatra, who will give us our first discussion points of today.
Thank you, and hopefully you can hear my voice. And then thank you once again for RTPI for bringing this wonderful seminar in the anniversary of Wharton Planning Days, the 75th, inviting us to share about what happening in Indonesia, especially in the new capital development. So basically, as you may know, in the term of new town development, this is still very young age. Yeah, it's still around 5 years from since we decided to move to the new capital, and then what President Jokowi emphasized when he opened our IAP anniversary, the 50th in 2021. He said, or he emphasized that planning is not only about building or design the building construction, but build environment, a living place that makes people healthy, vibrant life, economically sufficient, and livable to live. And then he also reminded us, don't make planning take local people aside from their hometown. So again, this is a very strong invitation for urban and regional planner in Indonesia to make a smart planning and design in the new capital. So this is a story of us in advocating since 2019, 2020, 2021. We are invited by the president to the palace, and then we discuss at national level and also at the Parliament House, and then uplifting the IKN discourse into global planning in the UN Habitat, Asia, Regional Office of Asia, Asian, and also the ISOCAP. So what basically that I to bring to this discussion is, the first is about the new capital and its relation to the national urban policies. So as you may know, Indonesia is an archipelagic state. We have 7 major islands, and then of course thousands of the small islands. But what we are trying to address is, we have the National Urban Development Strategy. Kalimantan is will be one of the destination for the managing the metropolizing region. This one, the south part and the east part. So the IKN, or the Nusantara, the new capital, is located in the one of the metropolitan strategies of our national program. And if you see, we also wrote about this featuring Nusantara, that we also see this is an opportunity for Indonesia to shift from the agricultural state to the maritime state. Because as you may see in these figures, the Strait Makassar is an international sea lane, where the coastal east coast of Kalimantan and also west coast of Sulawesi Island has many cities, and we hopefully Nusantara is a booster for the urban corridor development. And then for the Kalimantan itself, as you may see, this is the east corridor of Kalimantan Island. You see Balikpapan and Samarinda with the Nusantara in between. So this is also something that we can see that the direction of the urban development is alongside the coastal, not goes to the inside, to the inland, to the forestry area. So that's we keep the compact development for our cities. And we also try to link what Nusantara has already in the green one, linked to the oldest city in Kalimantan, Samarinda, and also Balikpapan, and to the new area that we call Samboja, the blue one. So it creates growth diamond of East Kalimantan that can strengthen many cities, not only four of the cities. So this is also strategy that we think that we can make the new capital grow healthier, because if not, then there is a very long time to increase them. And then what the key challenges and opportunities, this is my part, the end of part. First is green connectivity among cities. As you may see, the green one, and if we compare to the London 2050 vision, that you are trying to build national park city, we also try to develop smart forest city, but again, we include the biodiversity, because we have so many biodiversity assets surrounding the new capital, and how we make a design with the natural asset, biodiversity asset that we have. So that's our plan, by having more and more forest area. 65% of the total area is a forest, and then conservation habitat for the endemic vegetation and wildlife. This is also the second challenges, because there are 53 villages within the Nusantara area, and then we are trying also to embrace them, not to convert them into urban, but how then the urban-rural linkage can be incorporated into the spatial planning of Nusantara. In the early stage, that if we can make a zoom in, if you see the green one, we have a scenario for moving the people, civil servant, army, police, the family of army and police, construction worker. And again, this is still very early young age, is still 5 years, and we face difficulties in moving, of course. But then we're trying to support with the basic infrastructures. We create toll road to make it 45 minutes from Balikpapan to the Nusantara, solid waste retention pond, water piping, electricity, water dam, and every basic infrastructure is now being developed and operated. So then what the key challenges after on is about how we make our first priority. So if you see in this area, the first one is the capital palace into the alongside the corridor that we call Sumbu Kebangsaan, the axis is now being developed. This is the September 2024, and what the next task is how to make it as a living place, because buildings has been built, but the human can make this building alive. So this is also a very important stage in our new presidency, 2025, 2030, how then we can add the buildings, but at the same time, we can create more vibrant and also more people-centric, what the people needs in the new settlement like this. So I end my presentation here, and hopefully we can discuss later on. And I move it to David to share also his thought on this. Back to you, David.
Thanks very much, Andy. Hi, everybody. I'm David Mountain. I'm Research Manager at the Royal Town Planning Institute, and I'm delighted to be here with Robert. Robert, do you want to introduce yourself? Robert Templer.
Hello, everybody.
Thanks very much, Andy, President Andy organised an excellent conference that I attended in the Philippines, in New Clark City, a couple of months ago, an ISOCARP, International Society of City and Regional Planners Conference. And yes, the purpose of this section, we're going to do a bit more of a double act, and I'm going to show some images which I've stolen from various online sources, and I've put sources, image references at the end of the presentation. So there they are. And I thought we'd start with this map just to show the location, but Andy's already kind of helpfully gone into lots more detail than that. But these images are just in order to sort of provide a bit more of a sense of kind of photographic on the ground approach. Looks like we've taken the same image there. But I've got 3 questions for Andy, for Robert. The first one, so first, congratulations on your new book, Robert. Robert's book is on Nusantara and on the Capital Project, and I guess more of a kind of journalist perspective on it. Could you just tell us a bit about capital city relocation projects? Last time I checked, there wasn't any proposals to relocate the House of Parliament and Whitehall to the northeast of England or anything along those lines, but there is the current government's New Towns Task Force. And so there's a lot of conversation about new towns, and what makes capital city relocation projects different to sort of new settlement planning, new town planning more generally? What makes them different?
Well, all around the world, we've actually seen a resurgence in the past couple of decades of new capitals. Capital cities are different in certain ways. They carry a symbolic weight in that they, in some ways, must represent the state, and they often represent certain aspirations, and those can be sort of positive or negative. You have at the moment, just outside Cairo, a new capital being built, an extraordinary sort of grandiose, really excessive set of government buildings that has cost an absolute fortune and is quite possibly going to bankrupt Egypt. And this is being built for one of the main reasons that people build new capitals, which is to separate political functions from people who might want to disrupt those functions. In Egypt, more than a decade ago, we saw the Arab Spring uprisings. And so ultimately, General Sisi, who's the ruler of Egypt, decided that it was time to sort of separate out the government, military headquarters, all of these sort of functions, and has built this very overblown capital in the desert outside. And you've seen a similar thing in Myanmar about 2 decades ago when they built the new capital of Naypyidaw, which is a very strange, overblown set of buildings, the largest parliament building in the world, for example, in a country that doesn't actually have an active parliament at the moment. What's happening in Indonesia is a bit different, though, because this is really an effort to rethink urbanism in Indonesia, to build a capital which officials have said will be green, will be walkable, will be livable. The former head of the organization managing the project said he wanted it to be lovable. He wanted it to be about people. So although the presidential palace is a big, imposing place with a sort of set, if you like, for political theatre, that's a necessary part of any capital city. The rest of the city is actually being designed and being built in a way that is much more about people than most capitals. The new Egyptian capital, hugely bombastic, centered around cars, centered around a military headquarters. This capital is centered around walkability, around reconstructing the forests of Kalimantan, around ideas of nature, and around ideas of expressing the sort of large diversity of Indonesian culture. So it's quite a different project in its ethos and its intent to the grandiose or very utopian capitals that we've seen elsewhere in the world, such as Brasilia and Islamabad and Astana in Kazakhstan.
You've answered my second question there as well, which was about the kind of what makes it unique and different compared to similar scale projects. But maybe moving on to the third question, what are some of the challenges, do you think, for the successful development of Nusantara?
Well, I think, we've heard this many times, but the great difficulty in any new city, and I think particularly a capital city, is developing a sense of place. Capital cities tend to end up as sort of places for bureaucrats to spend Monday to Friday, and then they all disappear. And you have cities like Canberra, which is quite a beautiful location and quite a thoughtful design, but it's incredibly sort of desolate on Friday night or at the weekends. It's got a little better, but it still takes a very long time. Brasilia, for example, laid out in this sort of modernist 1960s sort of utopian vision. But it was a very desolate place, really, until mid-70s, 80s, when people generally started to build community there. It's very hard to build new communities. It's very hard to build a sense of place. I think there's generally in these cities an underinvestment in certain things like universities, culture, art, public art, all of these sorts of things, which are really, really necessary, I think, in order to end that kind of sterility. And the problem, of course, with planned cities is they don't necessarily allow for the sort of organic development that might create more atmosphere, more connection with the actual city. I think in the case of Nusantara, the designers have been quite mindful of creating spaces for people to gather. For example, in front of the presidential palace, which is the image you see in front of you, there's a long sort of axis that runs down from that. But rather than being an enormous street like Chang'an Avenue in Beijing or Red Square or a huge kind of pompous place for armies to march up and down, it's actually quite a beautiful, quite expressive park with a lot of walkways, trees. Obviously, it's going to take a while to grow into itself. But they've made a real effort to create spaces where people might gather, create spaces where people might sort of enjoy nature, enjoy parkland. They're creating spaces where people will be able to live a properly Indonesian life. And that often means street foods, markets, street life, all of these sorts of things. So they haven't neglected that. But I think it remains to be seen, once it's populated, how that kind of comes to life. I really hope they succeed in that, because I think, too many administrative capitals become these very polished places. And I think because of the emphasis here on jungle, on nature, on walkability, there's a real prospect of being able to, create more connected, more organic spaces. Obviously, at the moment, it's still under construction, and a lot remains to be done. But the hope is that they will be able to do something that's really quite different from existing Indonesian cities, and I think very different from most of the capital cities out there, or new capital cities.
One last quick question. Do you think there's anything for planners in the UK to learn from this experience so far?
Yes, in a lot of ways. I think one of the most important things about Nusantara is that it's Indonesian. It's been designed by Indonesians. The designer, for example, of the presidential palace is a Balinese sculptor of some renown in Indonesia. But the planning was done by Indonesians, construction's been done by Indonesians, the design, the ethos, all of these things have been set out by Indonesians. I think in Britain, you have a lot of very big companies that go around the world and build all sorts of things and do a lot of urban planning. And I think more often than not, they really neglect local context and local input. And I think one of the most important things about Nusantara is that Indonesians are building their own capital. And this is really something, it hasn't been designed by some combo of SOM and Arup and McKinsey's. It's been designed by Indonesians. And I think that's actually really important, that Indonesians can see themselves in certain ways in the design, in the, for example, the interiors of the presidential palace, in the way the buildings have been put together. It's not an arrogant design as well, but I think there's something really important in listening to locals, drawing on heritage, drawing on traditional systems of managing and living with nature. For example, most of the buildings in Nusantara are going to have a very light touch on the soil. They're going to be built on columns. Water is going to be able to flow beneath them. A lot of them are located kind of lower in valleys. For many of the buildings that you can see in this image, the bulk of the building is actually sort of hidden away in this hilly landscape. So they found ways to coexist a bit more with nature, with flooding, with water, with the tropical weather, with climate change, with the rising temperatures. All of these sorts of things have been thought about in this design. But I think one of the most important lessons anywhere is local context and really building for people who are going to live in a place.
I think we'll leave it at that. Thanks very much, Robert. Really interesting. And let's come back to some of these in the discussion. And I'll leave the link to your book in the chat. I think I'll try my best to do that. So I'm going to hand over to Fiona from Milton Keynes.
Fab. Thank you so much. That was fascinating. And I really liked some of the sort of the overlaps, I suppose, with Milton Keynes. There's lots of some big similarities, I think, there. So I'm Fiona Robinson. I was the MK Futures Programme Manager. I'm now a strategic lead for city projects. So I am involved in various strategic city building projects for Milton Keynes City Council. I've been at the council for about 16 years now. My background's in local plans, but now doing lots of these big strategic things. And I'm from Hemel Hempstead originally, so I'm a true New Towns girl. So my plan today is just to talk briefly about a bit of the history of Milton Keynes, its beginnings, where we are today, and some of the scale of what's been achieved over the last 60 years or so. Some of the lessons we've learned from that growth, and a bit about our ambitions for the future as well. So even before Milton Keynes was a thing, Bletchley had grown as one of these London overspill towns in the early 1950s, and both Bletchley Urban District and Buckinghamshire County Council had plans for further growth in the area. Bucks County's version was called Pooleyville, after their chief planner, and it was this monorail-based plan, very, what we would think of now as being transit-oriented development, I suppose. But the ministry overlooked both Bletchley and Pooleyville, and instead, in 1967, the new city of Milton Keynes was designated in that third and final wave of the UK New Towns. And obviously Milton Keynes, the perfect location, halfway between London, Birmingham, Oxford and Cambridge, and really the centre of the known universe, certainly in our world. But it wasn't a totally blank canvas. Obviously, there was that market towns of places like Bletchley and Wolverton, Newport Pagnell, Woburn Sands, and lots of other small villages as well. And so the setting up of the New Town Development Corporation in sort of 1967 and their plan for Milton Keynes in 1970, originally, that plan was for about 250,000 people, and later that target was increased. It now seems quite small in context with Nusantara and their 2 million residents. But the corporation took this view that there was that the planning of the new city should be guided by a set of explicit goals, and I don't think we disagree with any of these that are listed there today. And the plan laid out this grid pattern of cross-city roads and the linear park network and requirements for drainage and water supply and other basic services. And the policy map in our local plan today looks quite similar, really, to what was laid out in that original proposal. But obviously, those growth plans were not just about the homes. The Development Corporation was across all of the other things that needed to be provided alongside and to build a place and a community. So there was people involved in community development and involving residents in public art projects, and employing arrivals workers to help people settle into those newly built estates. That said, people were basically living in muddy building sites for years, and Newtown blues was definitely a thing. But inward investment and attracting companies to relocate to the city was essential as well in order to provide employment opportunities for new residents. And there were major marketing campaigns developed to help attract those companies and new residents to the place. So earlier this year, there was a Centre for Cities article, and the question was whether new towns are the answer to the UK's house building crisis. And there was this really interesting graph in that. So it said that in the 1980s, Milton Keynes contributed more than 1% of new homes in England, which sort of doesn't sound much, but also is a massive amount, really. The average Newtown Development Corporation built less than half the total that Milton Keynes did, despite Milton Keynes building its first house as late as 1970. And so I think Milton Keynes does show the art of the possible, but history does suggest that it was somewhat of an outlier, and there was a really nice line subtitle in that article that says not every new town can be Milton Keynes. So just some examples really of some of what the Development Corporation achieved. Some pretty unusual and unique developments in those early days, and architects were given a bit of a free rein, really, given whole grid squares to design whatever they wanted as long as it was delivered to meet a standard cost. So there's some examples here from Galley Hill and Netherfield, and they look so neat and modern back in the day, but to be honest, they look a little bit less sleek today. But it was a little bit hit and miss, a bit of a mixed story on how successful some of the developments were as well. So on the left there is our Grade 2 listed shopping building in the city centre, and it's full of natural light and high quality materials and really interesting planting. Really successful place. Some less successful though, the Agora, now demolished, on the right hand side there was a gift from the Development Corporation to the town of Wolverton, but it fundamentally cut the town centre in two, having been plonked at an angle in the middle of its Victorian grid pattern. A similar gift to the people of Stony Stratford by the same architect is now listed, and so it was definitely a bit hit and miss, as I say. And there's masses of public art, and including works that were created as part of that community development process. Things like the Bicycles mural created with students at Stantonbury School there, and the Tin Man in Bean Hill. And we've got this real tradition of innovation and doing things differently, and that continues today. So on the left-hand side, Homeworld from 1981 was this development to showcase different experimental designs from a range of different house builders, and they trialled all sorts of different technologies and different energy efficiency techniques that we still use in homes today. And on the right-hand side there, this is us hosting the European Smart City Robotics competition, which showcases how technology and AI and robots can help to solve real-life problems, with teams from all over Europe coming together to showcase their projects. And Milton Keynes does things at scale, albeit maybe not at the scale of Nusantara and creating a new capital city, but there's all sorts of facts, like there's more bridges than Venice and more shoreline than Jersey, and a slightly made up fact about there being 22 million trees and 200 miles of redways and 130 roundabouts, and we've got these big dual carriageways, or space for some of our roads to be dualled, and there's roundabouts and bridges, and sometimes just pedestrian bridges, but road bridges and underpasses, and there's just the sheer scale of that infrastructure. There is then this expectation from residents that new growth will match that same sort of standard, but it was obviously delivered under a completely different regime, different funding sort of setup, and really difficult to be able to match that now. And obviously that scale of infrastructure is really impressive, but it now is a bit of a burden when it all comes for renewal and need for investment and maintenance at the same sort of time. But that scale continues in the city centre as well, I think, really. So there's about 5,000 residents in the city centre today, and about 40,000 jobs registered in central Milton Keynes. But that footprint is about the same as Melbourne, which is a city for 5 million people, with about 60,000 people living in that central area and 300,000 jobs. So it does leave us with vast amounts of public realm that we need to manage and maintain. And this sort of low density nature of the city centre can also make it feel a little bit dead and lacking vitality and activity. So we're definitely giving some thought to how we can address that as a challenge. But excitingly, we are now a city. We'd always referred to ourselves as a city anyway, but it's nice to have it recognised, and our bid was sent off in one of our famous delivery robots, and you'd expect nothing less really from Milton Keynes. But you'll see there as well our Better by Design branding that we had. And it was up there for the King's visit when he came to give us the proper city status. It was part of our work to show what Milton Keynes is about and show that we're this dynamic and ambitious place that's unlike anywhere else. And it was just this really, really good backdrop, I think, really colourful backdrop for that visit. So bringing things up to date, there's lots going on still in Milton Keynes. From that 60,000 population back in 1970, we've now reached almost 300,000 people today. And this major growth continues, and we're achieving well over our planned targets each year, with a lot of urban extensions, but also lots more city centre development, including some that it will be led by Milton Keynes Development Partnership, who are a wholly owned development company owned by the council. And they're also working with us to deliver a new events venue in the city centre, and we hope also a new university, working with the Open University, who are already based in Milton Keynes. And so we're absolutely a place that is up for growth, and we talk about our new town roots, meaning we're built for that growth, and we recognise how development can help us to reinvest in our city. So back in 2021, we developed our strategy for 2050 as a long-term vision for the future growth of Milton Keynes, and this is now being taken forward through our new local plan, and we just finished consulting on our Regulation 18 draft of that this summer. And that plan includes sites for about 63,000 new homes to be built by the middle of the century, and that will take our population to well over 400,000 people. And we're also doing lots of thinking, like I say, about the city centre. And so I asked AI, I asked Copilot to come up with an image of the future of central Milton Keynes with our mass rapid transit and active travel along one of the boulevards. Lots of fun to play with, that AI sort of system, and a bit of a waste of time, really. You can get down a bit of a rabbit hole, really. But it's actually a pretty decent imagining of what we're trying to achieve, I think, as long as you don't look at it too long. And I think there's some dogs with 3 legs and stuff in there. But I also was struck that it looks quite a lot like that green space that Robert was talking about through the centre of Nusantara. So lots of parallels. So Milton Keynes definitely, like I say, up for doing more and faster and better. And we recognise that new towns can still play a really big role in future growth. So we recently hosted the first meeting of the New Towns Task Force, and we talked to them about the city's ambitions. Could Milton Keynes make it to their list of places that make a massive contribution to the country's need for new homes? Well, with the right tools and the right support in place, we are definitely keen to do more. But just wrapping up, really, there's definitely some important lessons to learn from our growth as a new town for planning new settlements. One of those is that it's not just about the homes. All of those other things that make up a community and make them a nice place to live and spend time need to be front and centre of plans. So don't get too lost in the numbers of homes. Think about the people that are living in them. And it was great to hear that in Nusantara, they really seem to be taking that more people-centric approach. We also need to think up front about how things are paid for, both now and into the future. So we've got organisations like the Parks Trust and the Community Foundation in Milton Keynes that do great work in helping to maintain important assets for our city. And we want to find ways to do more of that in the future, really. So part of that is thinking about how the city can continue to benefit from the growth by reinvesting in infrastructure and our citizens and securing the uplift in land value and building quality places. And we want to be able to continue to meet our tagline of being better by design and celebrate all those things that make Milton Keynes so unique. So thanks for listening. I think we're moving on to a bit of a panel discussion. So back to Meg.
Thank you, everybody. Yes, thank you very much to the panel there. That was really really fantastic, and I think a really articulate way of understanding how there's a slightly different approach on an international basis, but indeed how ultimately I think everybody sets out with the same principles and objectives to create places where people want to live. So if I could invite the panel just to come back onto camera, perhaps keep yourselves muted for now. But what we'll do is just go through a couple of questions that have been put forward by participants and people attending the webinar today. So I think we'll probably look at the questions broadly in order of where the presentations went today. So I suppose that the first questions for either Andy or Robert. And I think it is something that was touched on by yourself, Robert. But just one question that we have had again is to what extent at all did New Sonata draw on the lessons from previous new capital cities such as Canberra and Brasilia? I know you kind of you discussed that broadly, Robert, but just I suppose, Andy, if you've got any insight into that, and potentially whether it was learning what those those examples did well, or learning what they didn't do well, I guess, really. I don't know who wants to take it. Do you want to go first, Andy, if you've got anything to add?
Yeah, thank you. Again, Megan, I mean, it's still early stage for us, 5 years, but we learn a lot about from our neighbors, Putrajaya, and also Canberra, of course, and there are several new capital, right? The first is about to link the new capital with the surrounding cities, yeah, because at the end, the economic flow, the people flow come from the other cities, and then this is very important that the existing cities like Balikpapan do not take many or more economic opportunity, that we need to make them cooperate, so then there are shared function and role about cities. The second one, we try to delineate the area larger than usual. It's just a matter of we can preserve the land tenurial. So then we can preserve the forest, restore the forest, and make many programs for our climate adaptation, and of course for our disaster risk mitigation, because we also still face the risk of the forest fire. Yeah, so then this is very important to make, because at the beginning people criticize it's a huge area of the new capital, but at the same time we need to control that. Maybe that both that come first to my mind, and maybe Robert can add on. Yeah.
Oh, I think you're on mute, Robert.
Yeah.
Sorry. There we go.
Apparently, former President Jokowi was quite impressed by Canberra when he visited there. And there's no doubt that Canberra is quite a sort of scenic city. I'm not sure it's a model in terms of life and activities and everything else. It's a very big, sprawling area that lacks a certain density and walkability and various other things. I think one of the key aspects of design in Nusantara is to leave a lot of the forest, well, to regenerate a lot of the forest area, but to actually create a certain measure of density when it comes to housing and everything else, so that people will be in sort of walkable 15-minute areas connected by public transport. It's one of the first cities in Indonesia where public transport's been sort of thought about right from the start, and that's really a big change in Indonesia, which has not led the world, it has to be said. When it comes to public transport, Jakarta is woefully lacking in that. But I think, yeah, there was an interest around the place in other capitals, but I think a lot of it was the mistakes of other capitals. Putrajaya, for example, was built in a big former plantation area, a bit like Nusantara, but it's a very lifeless place. It's very much a place where bureaucrats come for the day and then go home at night. It lacks any sort of vitality. And it also was built with a very kind of ideological mission. Mohammed Mahathir, the then prime minister, wanted to present Malaysia as this sort of modern Islamic country. And therefore the architecture very much reflects this kind of Middle Eastern Islamic modernism. It doesn't really reflect Malaysia, to be honest. It doesn't reflect indigenous architecture or forms in Malaysia. I think Nusantara is much more connected to Indonesia in its design and its thinking. Whereas, to be honest, Putrajaya feels like a kind of big office park. I mean, quite fancy. The buildings are very nicely built, but the designs are quite alien to the country. It doesn't connect. It has no emotional resonance with anybody. And I do think like finding that emotional connection in certain ways, building it up over time. Immensely important in any city.
Oh, that's yeah. I mean, I think that's really helpful and insightful to understand where those influences have perhaps come from and lessons learned. I suppose somewhat building on what you've talked about there. Cognizant of the fact that there's these projects take time and that there's been some political change in Indonesia with a new president coming in. One of the questions that we've had is how has that change in political narrative affected what's happening, whether it be from a design perspective, a funding perspective, or a commitment to creating a new capital city, I suppose.
Yeah, I think the first thing that we need to uh, discuss is about the speed. Yeah, I mean, in the last 3 years of the presidency of Jokowi, we did sprint, right? Because we want to have an Independence Day at the location. But now I think the President Prabowo has time to uh, re check again which one is still missing, lack of it, and then we need more and more energy from the private sectors and also from the local communities to be involved actively, because at the end city is about stakeholders, is about all of the people, not only the government. So that's also lesson learned, that we think that we cannot build the city from the government's spending, only from the government services. So that's why I think this is a time to reflect again what have we done so far, and then I think the new head of authority is still Ministry of the former Minister of PUPR, Public Work, is Pak Basuki. So I think still the same leadership, but maybe just make it slower, and perhaps try to engage more and more private investment and also local community support. Yeah. So that's only the differences, I mean, for the next 5 years, in my opinion. Back to you, Megan.
Fantastic, thank you. I think we'll just take one more question in regard to New Sinatra before we move on to Fiona and Milton Keynes slightly, and planning for new settlements more generally. Obviously, part of what we've discussed today, and part of the, I suppose, rationale for New Sinatra was because there were some concerns about Jakarta and the sustainability of Jakarta, particularly with regard to flooding. So I suppose part of the question is, what's the plan for Jakarta? You don't want to abandon a wonderful city and take away the investment and opportunities. So how have you managed that? How have you managed making sure that you prioritise not just delivering a wonderful new capital city, but also making sure that a capital city that served Indonesia so wonderfully is respected, and that the residents there continue to receive all of the support and investment that they require?
Mm. Yeah, so this is also very interesting in the transition time of the moving capital. We want Jakarta more stronger, compete to Singapore, Kuala Lumpur in terms of the business and economic, and the national discourse about the role of Jakarta uh, is more, let's say, reshaping to the role of the economic and business center. But at the same time, to make Jakarta globally, there are several also new direction of the infrastructures, new direction of how we create environment to be better, air quality, at solid waste, and etc. So then we can attract more global talents come to Jakarta. Yeah. There are some issues in Jakarta now. For example, how we reuse the central government assets, the government offices. There are some discussion. The data is already there. The the data is on the table. It depend on the new president how to, let's say, to manage it. One example, for example, we want to brand Jakarta as the city of ASEAN. ASEAN is Southeast Asia, ASEAN, not Southeast Asian region, but ASEAN. I don't know, I forgot. Southeast Asian nation.
Association of Southeast Asian Nations.
Yes, correct. Association. Thank you, Robert. So then we try to make a brand as a city of, to make a brand as a city of ASEAN. And then this is like a stepping stone to become a global one. For example, for Asia, or later on for globally. So again, we have the new local election at this moment for Jakarta itself, and then the new candidate of the governor also bring the idea how this Jakarta look forward. But again, the dividing role from Jakarta and Nusantara is clear. I think at this moment, Jakarta play more on economic, but Nusantara play more on the government services, but with the derivative economic of the government services. For example, the tourism, the other urban sectors services that we think they can grow along the population's grow and connect with Samarinda and Balikpapan. So that's we are hoping, and we can evaluate later on in the next 5 years.
Fantastic. Robert, David, is there anything that you want to add on that, or any thoughts that you've got from a perspective of having studied what's going on in that neck of the woods?
Well, there are major problems in Jakarta. I mean, I love aspects of the city, people and food, and I always enjoy being there. But it's a hard city to love, to be honest, because it's very difficult to get around. It suffers from terrible pollution these days. The air pollution is quite severe. It urgently needs something in the region of $30 billion of infrastructure, in hidden infrastructure, in water systems and sewers and drainage and a coordinated flood management system and all of these things. It is an enormous city. I mean, officially it's about 11 million or something, but in reality it's probably more, 30 million people. And to be honest, the whole of West Java is really pretty much one city these days. So it does need a vast amount of spending on things that are not going to be seen. And that's always been a big challenge for Indonesian governments. You know, presidents have been happy to build big, flashy infrastructure projects, but they've never invested enough in the kind of underpinnings of the city. And that's the next 30 years have got to be about, protecting Jakarta from sea level rise, from flooding, from further environmental damage, improving the lives of people there, green space, denser housing, better public transport. Again, not enough thought has gone into, in Jakarta in some ways, has gone into really serving the people who live there. And to give you a very stark example, Indonesia started building its metro system about the same time that Shanghai did. Indonesia currently, Jakarta has a metro system of something like 13 stations, and a little bit more with some trains and other things. But Shanghai has the largest metro system in the world with nearly 600 stations and a complete coverage across an enormous metropolitan area. We need to see that level of investment in Jakarta, that level of focus on service provision and protection of people against these big environmental threats, which are only going to get worse. Just a small example, the number of people who are expected to die as a result of excess heat in Jakarta will grow by 20 times in the next 15 or so years as temperatures rise. Mostly old people. Population of the city is aging, temperatures are rising. There's very little provision, particularly for the poor, in terms of public health protection around heat. And to be honest, temperatures in Indonesia don't vary very much, but they're starting to. They're starting to get heat waves, starting to get very high temperatures. So all of these problems are kind of building up in Jakarta. Unfortunately, I think there's a lot to be said for what's happened in Nusantara, but it doesn't solve the problems of Jakarta in any way. And therefore, there still needs to be an enormous focus on greater efforts around the city and its general environment.
Absolutely. No, that's fantastic. That's really helpful, not just to understand how we plan for new towns, but we plan for the impact that it's going to have on neighbouring towns and cities as well. Also, Fiona, if I can just bring you in here to ask you a couple of questions, just cognizant of the fact that we've only got about 8 minutes left. But one of the questions that we've had is, do you think that a challenge for developing new settlements is that they get locked into their time? So Milton Keynes, for example, has a lot of 70s and 80s architecture and urban design, which is now considered visually unappealing is what's referenced here. I think I probably subjective. But yes, do you think that you know when something delivers en masse within a reasonably short period of time, it's less organic than what you would naturally expect when a city has developed over a much more extensive period of time?
Yeah, I think you're right. It's definitely more of an issue for those planned settlements growing at pace, at scale, over a short amount of time compared to those sort of more organically grown places. Yeah, and Milton Keynes and all of those sorts of places that are grown at scale and at pace, they're very much a point in time, I suppose. And I don't think anyone would think we would design a new Milton Keynes exactly how current Milton Keynes is designed. So there's things that are built into that structure that are probably not ideal. Like it's known for its car focus, and the amount of car parking, for example, in central Milton Keynes is phenomenal. And so I don't think we wouldn't do things in the same way as they did then. But one of the benefits is that it has given us a lot of scale, a lot of space rather, to do things differently now. So things like the dual carriageways that crisscross the city, well, yeah, they're great if you want to drive a car down, but actually they're also great if you want to run a mass rapid transit system down there, and you can reallocate some of that space to enable that. And the original planners built in that thinking. So they were thinking ahead to, well, things might need to change a little bit in the future. So that is one of the benefits. But and one of the other questions that's popped up there is about this, the sort of the design aesthetic, I suppose, of Milton Keynes, and it's picked up in that question as well. But it's having a bit of a moment again, actually. So we've been working on a new town heritage register, which is trying to identify those buildings that were developed during that development corporation period that are locally significant and do bring something to that local area, and it tells that new town story. So we're doing a big bit of work at the moment of trying to identify what those assets are, and about 160 of them have recently been considered and added to a register. So there's definitely a lot of thinking happening about that. So yeah, it is a challenge, but it's also, I suppose, recognising that there is some benefit to that, or there is an opportunity around that, and building in that space for adaptation as we're developing places now, I think is a really important thing. And it's the same issue for everywhere, I suppose, but it probably is more prominent in those new towns because they're very much of an era.
Exactly that, and it's surely inevitable when you're planning at scale that you're going to have it's going to work slightly differently. One of the other questions is: does the fact that Milton Keynes is a new town and a new city, does that help? I suppose both the council's understanding and local residents' understanding and acceptance of development en masse. So particularly thinking about what's going on in the southern area and the eastern areas of Milton Keynes at the moment around Bow Brick Hill. There's I suppose it's arguably fair to say that nationally there is in the UK there's a bit of concerns about SUEs and sustainable urban developments and development en masse. Is it easier for you guys to actually persuade local residents because I suppose they've seen development at scale en masse repeatedly?
Well, there is this funny thing, isn't there, that in places like Milton Keynes, there's always people saying, I remember when that was all fields. Well, actually, most people can say that about Milton Keynes. They can pick a bit of the city and say, I remember when that was all fields, because they're probably in an area that someone else remembered was fields anyway. So I think there is something that, as a new town, the place is built for that level of growth, and people can see that ongoing. But I think part of our challenge as well is this development corporation era, that it was set up obviously completely differently, even to how we might do a development corporation now. And they had masses of treasury funding and all of these sorts of tools to be able to drive infrastructure-led development. And so people have got used to, I suppose, having infrastructure before expansion, which is I before E, a thing that we talk about a lot in Milton Keynes. And there is an expectation, rightly so, that as we're building new developments, that all of those facilities and services and infrastructure goes in upfront for people. So, and we want to be able to continue that. Our residents deserve it, absolutely. But I suppose the development corporation era, when they were able to do all of that stuff with buckets of money from government, there is just a bit of a perception that we need to address, and that they think the council's just messing it up, really, because the development corporation did it better. But like I say, a different time and a different era. We do also have this challenge that some of our local residents, who were pretty vocal, were part of that development corporation and know how things were done and have an expectation of how things are developed. So that is an extra thing that you wouldn't get in York or Chester. The original planners are very very far gone in those places.
A whole new set of problems then for you guys with regard to that. But again, we've got just a couple of minutes. I'm going to just ask a question to the whole panel, invite everybody to come in. We've had a question that talks about funding for planners, and noting that it's, you know, World Town Planning Day today, and I think we're all incredibly proud of what we all do and how we contribute to the world en masse. It's a question of is particularly relevant to UK planners. Are there countries where we can take examples of how town planners are either better funded, or where town planners have got a little bit more, I don't know, I suppose respect, and where actually planning is viewed as a really important role? I think that there is a perception at the moment that the town planners in the UK have perhaps not had that for a while. I know that narrative is changing, but do we have examples where town planners are really celebrated and appreciated? I guess is the gist of the question.
Just quickly and kind of anecdotally, from what I've heard in the US, town planners are paid very good salaries. And I suspect that as part of the kind of history of that country, there's just a fairly strong kind of common consensus about the role of planning and its a purpose as a whole kind of society built on a kind of new settlement. Like, and I guess the US isn't the only country like that, with a kind of historical political kind of break where new kind of arrangements between government and citizens were kind of formed. But I do suspect that the US is a kind of interesting example.
Perfect. I do apologise. We are going to have to cut you off because I am very conscious that we will actually just cut off at past. So first of all, thank you very much to the panel for all of your really valuable contributions today. And please do take the handouts, and you will be asked to fill out a bit of a survey on the exit of this. If you could just make sure that you do that, that would be absolutely fantastic. But it's been an absolute pleasure to be joined today by the panel. And on behalf of the RTPI, thank you to everybody for joining, and for the panel for their really valuable questions. If there is anything else that you want to ask, we can access the questions, and I'm sure the RTPI can deal with those at a later date. So thank you very much.
Thank you. See you again.
Bye.